much for joining this World Happiness Week presented by the World Happiness Fest. This is the sixth day of incredible interactions with hundreds of experts. But as you know, having you here is very, very special. As editor of the World Happiness Report, it probably is you who has, I would say, the most insights of what's really going on around world happiness around the world. So thank you so much for joining and bringing us sunlight after all these 10 years of incredible work and actually setting the standard for what happiness is and should be and how it should be measured and enforced or invited to be used by everybody around the world. So thank you so much for joining and thank you so much for bringing so much light to many people. So what's the state of world happiness? What have we learned this year? And if you can benchmark this to the past years, what is the trend and what is the evolution?
To a considerable extent, the average of world life evaluations has been constant over the past 15 years. Because this is the 10th anniversary issue, we did essentially three things. We looked back over the whole data that we have from the Gallup World Poll, so starting back in 2006. So we have more than 15 years of data from that. And so that was part of our objective as to how have we done. We combined that also with a special chapter looking back and saying, how have concepts of happiness changed over this same time? So we're actually looking at the measures of happiness, but we're also looking at how seriously is it taken or how widely is it having an impact. So what Chris Barrington-Lee did in that chapter is that he looked over the whole corpus of books written in many languages. And one of the things he documented was that over the last 20 years, there's been a declining relative importance to the appearance of income and GDP, and a corresponding increase in the use of the word happiness. And even more than that, he discovered that from about the end of the century, starting early in this century, the notion of beyond GDP started taking off. So not GDP on its own, but beyond GDP. And from 2012, from the first World Happiness Report, that actual triplet of words, World Happiness Report, has started appearing very widely in the literature. And this is not academic versus anything else, it's just the whole literature in many languages, in English first, and then in other languages thereafter, and is now twice as frequently referred to as beyond GDP, and so still on a very rising upward movement. So you ask how things are going for happiness in general, then there are two ways of thinking about it. One is the average reported levels, which have been fairly stable, though up dramatically in some places and down in others and so on. And the other is how seriously, how importantly has the notion of happiness as something to be studied and developed come along? And the answer is there very rapidly. So that was nice to document that. Then, of course, we analyzed life under 2 years of COVID. Last year, we had only 1 year of data from COVID, and we were surprised somewhat to find that how resilient life evaluations were under COVID. The second year has shown exactly the same thing in terms of average life evaluations. But now we have the first and second years of COVID looking rather different. So that worry and stress that were predominant in the first year have diminished back towards baseline in the second year for reasons you could understand. Or vaccines on the way, the devil was more understood, and people were learning more about what they would have to do to either face it or evade it. And then the big surprise came that we found ourselves, when we looked, because we do spend more attention in last year's report and this year's report looking at emotions. Because they're more volatile, they change more rapidly. So with the stability of overall life evaluations, we then want to ask ourselves, is our emotions themselves also not moving? Of course, we found they did move much more. And then we dug deeper and found out which people are having which emotions in which continents going up and down. So in part of that expose in this year's chapter 2, we found that 3 measures of kindness, one of which we noticed last year, helping of strangers. We found that significantly up in 2020. But this year, that kindness effect has doubled, and we found large increases also in donations and volunteering. You could imagine why those were shut down more during the first year of the pandemic, but all 3 of them now well above pre-pandemic levels. And the striking thing from your and my perspective as people who look at the world, this was true in every one of the world's 10 regions.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. This is truly amazing, because something that we hear when doing the presentation of the World Happiness Report is about the focus on misery with respect to happiness. And I love your comment that we should be focusing on both, because actually when we focus on the positive as well as the negative, we are given the opportunity to elevate how we make an impact in the world. Can we work and can we think a bit more about that topic? Because we know that when we talk about happiness, when people are suffering, people reject, and they think, well, let's focus on the suffering first, and then we'll move into the happiness. But we know that actually doesn't work that way. Can you explain this and why we should be focusing on the positive as much as we focus on the negative?
Yeah, it's you're absolutely right, and it's something you've worked on a lot, and it's fundamental. It's what distinguishes what we do from conventional finding of a problem and trying to fix it. So we stand back and say, let's look at life as a whole, and then ask ourselves how it could be made better, how it could be made better for everybody, of course. But we find that the best way of improving life for those whose lives are worst is improving the central framework that also helps everybody. And take an example in the health, where the WHO put this in their mantra back in the 1940s. This is not about that. Health should not be just about curing illnesses, i.e. repairing miseries, but building health, i.e., and that's, of course, the support for happiness for everybody. And so this shift from thinking of good health as something you only deal with when a train has come off the tracks and you put it back on the tracks, and it's really about designing a set of tracks which trains will not fall off. And one of the specific examples that people have talked, for example, both in COVID and pre-COVID, of an epidemic of loneliness. The idea is that, and the UK even found themselves with a minister for loneliness. Yeah. And I said, that's exactly backwards. For loneliness, you don't need a cure, you need a vaccine. Because you should never get loneliness in the first place. If you wait and then treat loneliness as an illness, Then you cast aspersions on the person who's lonely. What have they done wrong that's made them lonely in the first place? What have they missed out? And then you split the population, and then you're back in the repair mode. You want to think about it as a case, what kind of a society do we need, can we get, that will allow people to develop their own lives in ways that, of course, makes them not lonely, but also keeps them healthy and keeps them happy. There's one second, so that's a whole line of argument you could imagine we have zillions of examples of, but it's clear enough. Let me stop there and let you carry on.
Well, I love it. And I think that for some reason, we have to keep repeating this because it's so easy to get into the trap of misery. So easy. So actually in Zaragoza, where we are having the in-person festival, it was very important to position happiness as a preventive measure for wars, for crisis, for anger even. And I think that people are starting to understand that if we focus on prevention, that's going to help. And then people support. But building on that, when I look at your chapter number 2, actually you talk about the pandemic of benevolence. So this is going on. Do you think that because of what we are getting, we can foresee a better future in the coming years because of this pandemic of benevolence right now? We think that it can be preventive for a future illness, or it could be an accelerator for better behavior?
Certainly. And there are two channels for that. One is that simply to know that other people are being benevolent, are kind to each other all over the world, changes the way you think about the world and changes the way you think about life. Because we're in a news feed world where both conventional media and social media often are very good at picking out things that have gone badly for somebody and making them seem much more common than they are. So you see bad things being done, and you then assume that they're more common than they are. So simply to increase the understanding and the extent of benevolence will, in fact, enable it to play a more important part in people's lives. And of course, that's what you need. You want the social norms to be ones for individuals and for societies where people appreciate that other people are watching their back. And in fact, that will make them more likely themselves to do that. So when you ask me, is this pandemic of benevolence something that's likely to continue? And I say, well, that depends. If in fact, these seeds of knowledge are planted where people are already thinking that way. You see, one extra thing that struck us about this, we're used to seeing pandemics of the normal sort, both in illness and in anger, as being transmitted by the media, right? You see them something, a freedom convoy here, sparks of freedom convoy somewhere else, and you get this quick transmission. This pandemic of benevolence came about in every region of the world with no transmission. There was no pushing. It was coming up spontaneously everywhere, and that's very powerful. So that means it was genuine. And so for people to see that this isn't somebody saying this is a new campaign, let's all be kind to neighbors. This was happening at every part in the world. So it was one very powerful example of a phenomenon we've seen time and time again in previous natural disasters. And even when criminal things happen, the bystander effect, the real bystander effect, and this is now increasingly studied, is not to walk by and say, I don't see anything. It's to rush in and help. And that's in fact what happens. And when it happens, then the people who do it are happier, the people who receive the help are happier, and the people who see this happening are happier because they really like living in a benevolent society. You'll remember in last year's report, we presented that evidence about feeling that your wallet would be returned if it was lost. And the power of that over your feeling about your life was absolutely phenomenal. Well, you can think about this current pandemic of benevolence of being, in a way, an example of that. This is the COVID was a wallet being dropped, and people were coming out and much more likely to help strangers as a consequence of that. So to witness that it ought to make us all happier and more likely to act that way in the future. And that's getting back to your question. How sure are we, or hopeful are we, that this is going to move forward into a more helpful society in the future, when we have to trade it off against what are sources and evidence of anger, for example. We did note, however, if I put in one more footnote and then get back to you, that anger is in fact less prevalent than other negative emotions and has not been at a global level on a rising trend over this past 15 years. It's been at a high level and sustained there, highest level in the Middle East and North Africa, and some rising trend in South Asia, but elsewhere, no such trends, which is itself good news because you have much more evidence of anger. You have people think there's in fact, a greater incidence, but in fact, if you go out to the population as a whole and say, well, are you in fact feeling more angry than you used to? And the answer is no.
It's so interesting about when we focus on anger, because we know from a psychological point of view that it is a very important and needed energy that we need in order to create change. The issue here is when you channel the anger into distraction instead of construction. But actually getting angry is not by default bad. It's actually, it could be very positive, because that's what creates changes. I think probably here, if we are thinking of this pandemic of benevolence, because people feel that there is injustice and you are closer to the victim than to someone who is harming, and you combine this with the right funneling of energy after anger, probably right now we are facing in the world a huge opportunity to improve the levels of happiness collectively, because we are combining two powerful forces. One is anger channeled into benevolence and into caring. What do you think about this? Do you think this is going to be possible? Or do you think at some point, because of what we are seeing today with war in Ukraine and many other places, and so much injustice in so many places and inequalities, that this might go in the more negative side?
It's one of the unfortunate features of the increasing focus on well-being in times of COVID, that people have focused more and more on injustices and ill-being and not on well-being. And so you have to understand the injustices of the past as to set a benchmark. But there has been too much attention to reheating injustices rather than working together to create a better future. I mean, that's what a happier world is going to be. It's not going to be my relatives blaming your relatives for things gone on in centuries past. It's going to be, we're all in this together now. What can we do to make it better? And it's moving beyond. I mean, in Canada, the process has been described as truth and reconciliation. And so the question is, how much truth before you take your main attention and focus it on reconciliation? And it's even more than reconciliation. It's building something better and fresh. Absolutely. And we do see among Indigenous communities in Canada, huge increase in pride and in a sense of capacity to build their their own future and our own future, and to be leaders for our common future. And once you have that, then you have the bedrock on which you can build. But it's too easy to get stuck in recycling old injustices rather than saying, well, let's talk positively about what we can build together, because we do know happiness is based not on feeling ill done by, but by feeling you yourself have a capacity to build a better life for you, your friends, and more for the world. This is one of the COVID effects we have found, is that people are rethinking their lives. And those that are rethinking their lives almost always are shifting from a material mode or a more material mode, where there is always a sort of comparative effect. How do you define how good a house or something you need is? It's better or bigger than your neighbors. So there's a bit of zero sum in the material world, which if you move to the purpose world, which is what people are often doing now in their jobs, they're saying, I want a job that is doing something to help people. I don't want to just be working for the money to buy the next piece of equipment. So when I get a choice, I'll choose in favor of something that's building a better future. Well, that in itself makes you happier. It, of course, increases the possibilities for having a sustainable world, because the well-being we get through sharing friendship has no draw on the physical carrying capacity of the ecosphere.
When you first built the report, you created this country called dystopia. And that's beautiful, because actually I talk about happitalism as a new paradigm based on happiness, and that's a new paradigm between dystopias and utopias. I wonder if dystopia, you have to create dystopia today and it would be the same, or you would start with a new set of KPIs, key performance indicators, after you've learned. It's like, is there something that you learned over these 10 years that would change dystopia going forward, or you will keep dystopia as is?
Well, dystopia, as you know, one thing worth reminding those watching this, because they often get a different message from the media, who talk of our country rankings are not based on an index that we construct of things that make for happiness. They're based and only based on people's own answers to the question. So we're just reporting back to the world what people are saying about themselves. There's no expert involvement at all. Dystopia, on the other hand, is something we created. And we created it for a kind of simple reason, because we wanted to have a picture that showed the total score. And then we tried to build models that might explain it. We don't fully explain it, of course. We're wrong and up and down on a variety of countries. But these 6 factors we often use, we wanted some way of showing how much each of them contributed to each country. Well, we wanted them to be positive bars adding up, right, to a total. Well, the only way you can make that happen is if you've got a basis of comparison against which every country is at that level or higher, for whether it's income or healthy life expectancy. So then that number is by its very nature, for a country that has the world's lowest value for income, for healthy life expectancy, for someone to count on in times of trouble, for generosity, for corruption, and for a sense of freedom. There is no one country, of course, that's lowest in everything, but that defines dystopia. And it makes a lot of sense, right? You could say, what if you really were the worst in the world at everything? Would you be negative? Where would you be? And the answer is, and it's something that varies quite a lot. You notice dystopia's value has come down this year. And the reason it's come down is because measured Venezuelan GDP is way down. I mean, it's down about a quarter of Angola. The point is, it's per capita. It's not being properly measured in situations of where the commercial economy is essentially broken down. So as that situation is resolved, dystopia will rise again. So yes, it changes every year. And it would change if we changed our modeling, as we would do to the extent we get variables that dig deeper or better into the space we call humanity. But the concept is going to stick with us.
So just a bit more on this and GDP, because we all know that there's a whole movement that wants to go beyond GDP in the way we measure our overall wealth and especially our well-being. However, we have GDP as part of the dystopia levels of measurement. So would you see a time where actually we are not using GDP at all in order to measure levels of happiness, knowing that what is part of GDP is something that is not measuring the reality of our well-being? Or do you think that GDP is always going to be part of the equation?
We've never said it shouldn't be part of what, I mean, it would be, once you look at the data and say, let's look at how people value their lives, people are happier in a situation where there is no hunger, where there is material goods to go around, and where people have more options to develop their lives. And so it's no surprise that we continually find empirically that income is an important source. It varies according to the measure you use. GDP is not the right measure to use for income. And indeed, when we do our micro modeling, looking at the individuals, we use household disposable income as the measure. And you should think of it in a longer term environment too. And we expect it to have, and in part, in some of our earlier work, we used also the answer to a Gallup question, have any of your family had to go hungry in the last 30 days? Not enough money to buy food for your family in the last 30 days. And so when we put that in, of course, then it lowers the effective income, because it is in fact one of the main channels through which income enables happiness, is to raise people up. So there's this kind of, it's this material sufficiency. I mean, Aristotle was quite clear about it. He said, he said it in a variety of different ways. You have to have your food on the table. And that's what income is about. It's about assuring material advantages, sufficiency. So to rule it out because we think emphasis on GDP alone is wrong, to say, well, we're going to say it has no importance. That's not the world we live in. Because once we say we're relying on other people to tell us about their lives, we're not going to decide what's important to their lives. We will then use our modeling to say what in fact does seem to support happier lives. And income is clearly one of those things. So there's no way we would ever remove it, because how could we, and be honest scholars? It's a fact of the world. The whole point is, it's a much, much smaller part of the whole. It's a small part of the support for a happier life. And so what the emphasis is especially the social, right? I mean, we've now changed the relative importance of the social context from nothing to the majority part. And that's the way it ought to be. And of course, with more emphasis on the social, which does not use material resources typically. So we can be happier together without drawing down any resources or getting any more carbon spewing out. So the more you shift to building the social and reducing the impact of the material, the easier it is to build a happy and sustainable future.
Let's keep going, exploring a bit more these factors that are new to this report, like the biological basis for happiness, and then this new survey on balance and harmony. Can you comment a bit more on that? Because something that for me is always it makes me think a lot, framing happiness on countries instead of on people. now that we have these two chapters actually thinking of the genetics and thinking about peace and harmony, I think that this is giving us a huge opportunity to think about communities and even neighborhoods beyond countries.
Yes.
But that's just in my mind. But can you comment a bit more why you brought genetics and harmony and peace to this report?
Well, I mean, essentially, the third, we were looking back, we were looking at life in COVID. We're going to say, how do we look at happiness in the future? How is it being looked at in the future? Well, there's this important strand of research from geneticists and biologists and students of neurology about what are the physical counterparts of the emotions we see. So there were mainly geneticists who were the authors of the chapter, but they did get into the gut biome and the neurology as well. And to understand that is a way of helping to unpack. The key point they make in the chapter is to say, once you understand that everybody is different, you may want to think about the way you design institutions so that the particular set of opportunities you offer to everybody, you may want to have enough variety so that you can produce things that are good for everybody and not, because they say it's not one size fits all. We have received some comments back from questions back saying, if it's true that a substantial proportion of the difference across individuals is due to their own genetic endowments in how they feel about life, what about the big differences across countries? What is the linkage there? And the answer to that is, the reason the countries differ is not because the genetics differ, it's because the living environments differ. Mm-hmm. And how can I be so confident of that? Because 2 or 3 years ago, we did a detailed study. And inside and outside the Gallup World Poll, we're doing it with the national polls in the United Kingdom and Canada. So we were able to look at migrants from 50 different countries coming to the UK and coming to, or 100 different countries actually, coming to the UK and coming to Canada. And we find that their happiness moves regardless of what level of the country they came from. It moves to the average happiness level of the country they're moving to. And picking up your neighborhood point, it moves to the level in that part of the country that they moved to. So that's really telling you. So it couldn't be a genetic difference, or the migrants wouldn't move, right? Because they'd have their set point and they'd be as unhappy in Canada as they were where they came from, or as happy, because it works as a convergence up or down, depending on where you move. On the peace and harmony, the second chapter you mentioned, the original notion, I think, of the sponsors of this was to show that a feeling of balance in life and a feeling of being at peace with life and a focus on others rather than yourself, which are center points of a lot of Eastern philosophies, would in fact be more prevalent in especially the East Asia. And the beauty of having these data, and as you well know, in psychology, there's a complaint that too much of psychology is based on what are called weird countries, Western, educated, industrial, rich democracies. And if you looked elsewhere, you'd find life was very different. Well, you see, we now had these variables and we could see how they mattered and what their levels were all over the world. We found that, in fact, the highest levels of these purportedly East Asian values of balance and peace and focus on others rather than yourself were all higher in the Nordic countries than they were anywhere in the world. So these are important variables, and they capture a good part of, they capture elements of what makes for a good life. But a society where people do care about each other is going to be one where, in fact, it's easier to achieve a sense of balance in your life. And indeed, that's one of the objectives. A purpose in life is obviously important too, and a focus on others rather than yourself. In some sense, that is a purpose type variable, but that too is higher in the Nordic countries than elsewhere. But more importantly, when we then asked, how important are these variables in explaining well-being, it turns out they're important all over the world. All over the world. So the more we look at this, yes, we find regional differences in what people talk about, what they think about, the way their institutions function. But what matters to people as people, this sense of trusted social connection is everywhere.
So interesting. Can I ask you a bit more about this sense that we keep hearing in the happiness space and the happiness movement about you choose happiness. So it's a personal choice. But at the same time, we all know, and even there are many methodologies that instead of measuring you choosing or not choosing happiness, they measure the conditions for thriving and evolving. Can you comment a bit more between choosing happiness and the conditions to happiness? How does it work?
Well, there's this another big point sitting at the side of that conversation, which is it to seek happiness, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is, to seek your own personal happiness is a dangerous thing to seek, because happiness should not be a personal objective. It should be a result. And there are philosophers over the centuries who've recognized that. And there are now many psychologists who've tested it. And you can see why, right? We once had a seminar where we talked about this, and then one of the members of the seminar went off and helped someone in an airport, and they were delighted, the person they helped. They felt really good about helping them. And then he came back and he said, it doesn't work. He said, because I feel ashamed because I did this just to make me happy. And so I said, Charles, that's not the way to think about it. Because if you didn't reach out and help that person at the airport, they would be less happy. They would be less likely to do something like that for someone else in the future. And other people seeing it would be less likely to do it. So you don't want to give that consequence just so you can avoid a niggling feeling of guilt that you were doing it for your own good. The important point is to say, that's a bonus. You're doing it for those other consequences. Forget the fact that you now know that it made you happier to do it. Accept that as something random. Don't focus on it, because if you do focus on it and say, I won't do it because it makes me happier, then of course you're making the world a worse place for everyone. Richard Layard and his Action for Happiness has a way of putting that, which I think is good. He said, well, why not think of it, the goal being the happiness of others? Because once you do that, and of course, that's what the golden rule is, and the golden rule is central to every religion. It's saying, think about the happiness of others. And in fact, then you get your own happiness as an outcome rather than as an objective. And that leads you into behavior that will produce the conditions for happiness. See, the conditions for happiness are the results of many, many decisions by people who build systems, people who operate systems, and people who live in them. So there's no contradiction between the two. You need a well-organized set of objectives, but downplay the personal happiness seeking. And we see in the happiness movement, there's a lot of the airport books are really about how to make yourself happy. And that's the wrong focus. A lot of the things they say, in fact, are the right things, and you should be doing them, but it'll work better and be a more sustainable once people recognize that the objective is not happiness for you, it's happiness for everybody. And that will, in fact, do pretty well for you too.
Yeah, this is so important because it's not obvious for many people. I think we should keep thinking and reinforcing this message over and over, because actually when you work and you think of everybody's happiness, that's what's really going to make a difference in the world. That's why I feel that this pandemic of benevolence that you talk about is because we are suffering collectively. I feel that we are going through a collective awareness of trauma. And when we have collective awareness, I think that we have the opportunity to have collective healing at the same time. But it has to be collective. So thank you so much for reminding us about this important factor. I have a last question just to wrap up. Well, it's been a decade, and it's been shaping in many ways policymaking, the way people understand progress. What do you see happening over the next decade? What is going to be your personal focus? And where is your heart going to be over the next 10 years?
Well, the widening and deepening of the understanding is heartwarming and encouraging. So, and naturally, my hope is that that will continue. As you know, what brought readers into the World Happiness Report in the first instance was to see how their country ranked. And as you and I have discussed before, that is just a sales gimmick. That's not the objective. That's of no purpose or use to anybody. But once people are in the tent, then they want to know more about what underlies it. What is the source? In other words, think about what goes on in the Nordic countries. What is there that we might learn about? What is there in our daily lives that we might think about and reorganize and increase happiness? Because, of course, there can only be one team at the top of a soccer league, but on the Happiness League, everybody can play a better game, and it doesn't matter whether it's better or worse than somebody else. If it's closer to what you in today's environment can achieve together for each other, then it's got to be a good thing.
Well, Professor John Helliwell, is always amazing having these conversations and learning. Of course, we all have to go deeper into every chapter, 6 amazing chapters that bring so much light. And of course, that we know that Finland came up top of the ranking in this case, but we know as well that that's just one really small part of the whole World Happiness Report. So thank you so much for everything that you've been doing over the last decade. And I want to see you going deeper and wider, and we are here to help with that over the next 10 years. So thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for what you are doing to spread these thoughts and benevolent actions around the world.
Thank you so much.